Marjorie was a woman who, for years, had been burdened with very low self-esteem. In his book, Mistreated, Ron Lee Davis talks about Marjorie and how she saw herself as unlovely, ungainly, untalented, unintelligent, everything that makes us have a sense of value and purpose and being worthwhile. And over the years of feeling like that, she finally became desperate. And in that desperation, she turned to a Christian psychologist. And when she went into his office, they walked together through her life and made it all the way back to one specific memory from her childhood. In third grade, Marjorie had been caught in the act of some minor thing of disobedience, and she had a rather vindictive teacher. And so this teacher had Marjorie stand in front of the whole classroom, and she held a piece of chalk, and she called out to the whole classroom and said, one by one, I want each of you to come up here, take this piece of chalk, and write on the board a sentence beginning with the word Marjorie. And I want you to write down one thing that you do not like about this bad little girl. So one by one, this class went forward, and Marjorie lived a nightmare in real life. Every child wrote some sort of hurtful statement about her, letters that are several inches tall, easily read around the whole classroom. Things like, Marjorie is ugly, Marjorie is fat, Marjorie is a slob, Marjorie has no friends, Marjorie is stupid. And standing in front of the class, Marjorie wished that she could just sink into the floor and disappear. But she stood there as one by one, this entire 25-student class had their turn. And by the end of it, Marjorie was there standing in front of a board that contained all of her deepest insecurities, all of her deepest fears written in glaring letters. Can you just imagine that type of humiliation? I mean, what if you had a blackboard that people could come up and write all the things they don't like about you on there? I mean, what would it say? I'd imagine that there'd be a lot of things that would get written on there that maybe I thought I got better at, but then clearly not. Or maybe there's things written on there that I didn't think anyone knew about. Maybe there's things written on there that I know but I'm ashamed of. And just one by one, things pop up on that blackboard. Life can be pretty cruel to us. And those moments when life just is piling down on us, we can feel like we don't know what to do. We have these moments of hopelessness and helplessness where we're not sure what we even can do other than just stand there and let it pile on. How do you respond to those moments of pure helplessness? We're going to read about some people today in our passage who were in a moment of helplessness and hopelessness and didn't know what they could do, but they still persevered. They still did what they thought they could do, even if they didn't have the whole picture, even if they didn't understand everything. They just did what they could and kept serving. And I think it's a pretty good example of faith for us. Let's go ahead and read this passage. If you're there in Mark 15, we're going to start in verse 42 and read to the end of the chapter. Mark says it was preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that Jesus had already died. Summoning the centurion, he asked if Jesus had died. And when he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. There's some details here that we probably need to put ourselves back in that culture to understand. Like, for instance, one thing that the Jews of that day did differently than we do now. I mean, there was a lot of things, but one of the most glaring things is how they counted a day. They didn't go from midnight to midnight like how we do. They would go from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. And so when Mark says it was preparation day, we know that preparation day, the day before the Sabbath, started Thursday night at 6 and it ended Friday night at 6. And Friday night at 6 is when the Sabbath would start. And I say that because what that shows us is that since last week we saw Jesus died about 3, is that Joseph only had like 2 or 3 hours to get Jesus' body prepared and in the tomb before the Sabbath started, and he wasn't able to do any work. So he was a little bit rushed to get this all done before 6 o'clock. And so Joseph here is described as a prominent member of the council. And yeah, that's the same council that voted to have Jesus killed. So you got to figure he's in a bit of an awkward position here. Because all of his best friends, all the people that are his brothers, are the ones that called for Jesus' death. And yet we find out from Luke that Joseph had not consented to that sentence. So I don't know if that meant that he just didn't show up for the council meetings that they were condemning Jesus, or he was there and he just didn't vocalize anything. We don't know for sure. We do know that he was a secret disciple of Jesus. But this word prominent could also just be meaning wealthy or well off. The American Standard Version, for instance, says he was a councilor or a councilman of honorable estate. So he was a pretty well-off guy who had good standing in the Sanhedrin. And so John tells us that Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus, but it appears that at this moment, after Jesus is killed, it's not going to be a secret anymore. And Mark tells us that he went to Pilate and boldly asked for Jesus' body. And that was a bold move. I mean, keep in mind, all the people that he was closest to were the ones that had Jesus killed. And now he's going and showing kindness to the body of Jesus, to his memory. And so you got to wonder, what would they even do to him if they found out that he was doing this? I mean, they killed Jesus. They could have easily asked for Joseph to be killed. If you liked him so much, why don't you join him, type of thing. But Joseph doesn't care. He just does it anyway. And when he goes to Pilate, he's surprised to hear that Jesus already died, which to me seems kind of odd, because we've looked over the last 3 weeks or so as to all the things that Jesus endured physically. Being flogged, which killed people 60% of the time, then being crucified and hanging on a cross, and he survived for 6 hours. I mean, that's not a fast death by any definition. But most likely Pilate was surprised because, amazingly enough, crucifixion victims did actually tend to last quite a bit longer than just 6 hours. In fact, sometimes they would last many days. The people that Jesus was crucified with, for instance, were still alive. John 19 tells us that the Jewish leaders went to Pilate and asked that they have their legs broken so that they could die and have their bodies taken down, so you don't have these people just hanging on a cross all weekend long through the Sabbath. And there was reasons for that, but they would break the legs of the people that were still alive so that they finally would not be able to breathe, not support themselves. It would just be so much shock that typically within minutes they would be gone. And so that's exactly what they did. They broke the legs. But then John in John 19 tells us that when they came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. And so they didn't break his legs, which was a fulfillment of prophecy. The Old Testament said his legs would never be broken. But they did say that they pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water came pouring out, which is a very odd detail about the death of Jesus. There's a lot of debate about how exactly Jesus died. There's been a couple of studies done where most commonly people believe it's from asphyxiation, right? They suffocated because their lungs aren't able to get all the stuff out, and so your lungs fill up and you can't breathe and you just go that way. And so that's a pretty common belief, and that's actually why they would break the legs, so that they would suffocate along with all the other things that they were going through. But this little detail in John's gospel has given rise to another theory, that perhaps Jesus didn't actually die from asphyxiation There's your $10 word for the day. I'm not going to say it again. Anyway, but that he didn't die from that, but rather he died from a ruptured heart. There's this little picture that I found online that if you wanted a very quick anatomy lesson, here you go. But around the heart, there's this stuff called the pericardium that surrounds the heart. And when your heart ruptures, if that were to happen, blood is in there and it starts to clot into red clot that looks like blood. It is blood. And then also it splits into something called the lipid serum or water. And so what people think happened is that Jesus' heart actually broke. It ruptured. And when they pierced his side, they pierced his heart and out flowed blood and water separate. I don't know for sure what exactly happened if that was the case. Well, what we need to know for sure is that Jesus was in fact dead. And I think that's what John's main point was, is that he was dead. Typically, crucifixion victims, after they died, especially those who were killed as insurrectionists, were just taken down and thrown into a common grave. They weren't shown any dignity or respect. Occasionally, they would allow the family to come and claim the body and care for it in the way that they want to, but Jesus' family and friends have all kind of gone away, or they're too afraid to come forward at this point. And so we see this guy named Joseph come up and claim his body, along with a guy named Nicodemus, which if you've read the Gospel of John, you'd be familiar with him. In John 3, for instance, Jesus has a conversation with him, and he says, "How you say I need to be born again? How can I enter my mom's womb and then come out again? I don't understand." John 3:16 happens during that conversation with him, between him and Jesus. So Joseph and Nicodemus take Jesus' body down, and the whole process for preparing a body was quite extensive. They would wash the body first, get it all cleaned up, which might be why when Jesus resurrected, he wasn't covered in blood, he wasn't matted in blood, because they would have washed him completely. That, and God is capable of doing a lot of miracles, like cleaning a person, so there's that. But anyway, so they would wash his body. Then typically they would put nard all over the body, which was like a very thick perfume that once it dried out would create a sort of preservation technique that wasn't quite as good as mummification, but still quite effective. However, Joseph and Nicodemus are sort of pressed on time, so they actually skip that step. And in John 19:39 and 40, it says that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. So Joseph provided the tomb and the linen, and Nicodemus brought 75 pounds of perfume as they got him ready. And a lot of people think they probably had some help. They were both well-off people, so they had servants. But regardless, they bring in all this to prepare Jesus, and then they roll this stone in front of the tomb. And something interesting I learned this last week is that in one of our earliest Greek and Latin manuscripts that we have of the Bible, there's a parenthetical comment on Mark 16:4. I know my numbers. Mark 16:4. And what that means is this is something that the transcriber, the guy who was writing it, he put this comment there. It's not sound, it's not the Bible, but it's a comment that he wrote down, and he said this: "And when he was laid there, Joseph put against the tomb a stone which 20 men could not roll away." That's a pretty big stone. There was actually two professors or faculty members from Georgia Tech that heard Josh McDowell talk about this once. So they went back and they started mapping out how big this stone would have to be, and they wrote Josh McDowell a letter detailing in all this intricate detail all of these terms and technical things about how big the stone was, and then they concluded simply by saying this stone would have had to be between 1.5 and 2 tons. That's a rather sizable boulder. 4,000 pounds. Could we get the fans on? I'm sorry. I'm already sweating right through this shirt. Anyway, but 4,000 pounds. That's a big boulder. And not only was this boulder huge, but Matthew 27:66 tells us that Pilate had his seal put on it, which, is the wax thing, not the animal, obviously. Okay, good. I shouldn't speak when my mind starts thinking. Anyway, But he brings his seal, and now I'm going to think seal every time I say it. He brings his seal, and what that would mean is that no one but someone from Pilate, with his express permission, would be able to get into the tomb. And so robbers and other people like that wouldn't want to come near it, especially since he put up a guard around it 24/7. So you got to figure, just picture all of this, is that Jesus had been badly beaten, he had been flogged, he had been nailed to a cross, he hung there for 6 hours, died, and then was pierced, was washed and prepared and wrapped in 75 pounds of just perfume, not even counting the linen, but just wrapped up like that, laid in a tomb with a 4,000-pound boulder put in front of it with the seal of Pilate, knowing that no one was going to be able to get in, that he was gone, he was dead. All these different theories that we've heard of how Jesus wasn't actually dead or they went to the wrong tomb or something like that. We'll talk more about that next week, but it doesn't make any sense. And it's not explainable that we have 4 people telling us exactly what Jesus went through after he died. He was gone. And in the eyes of his apostles, so was the hope. And yet some people still remained. These women that Mark mentions at the end of Mark 15 are still there. And then, of course, Joseph and Nicodemus. They still served Jesus the best that they could, even though they didn't have the full picture, even though they didn't understand why this was happening. And we actually know very little about what happened during those 3 days that Jesus was dead. We don't know quite what he was going through. We don't know what the disciples were doing. What we can see from the women coming on Easter morning is that they were trying to regroup. They were probably trying to figure out what they were going to do next, because they had the Sabbath to rest and think and work through their emotions. But as far as they knew, it was over. I think the best way you could summarize how they were feeling during this time was that they were like a sheep without a shepherd. Back in Mark 14, when right before Peter declares to Jesus that I will never leave you, I will never deny you, even if everybody else does, Jesus gives this warning to them: you will all fall away. For as it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. They had lost their way. They had scattered. They were all around, and everything that Jesus had promised them didn't make any sense now. This idea that they had about him was shattered. They were just scattered. And yet, in the midst of all this confusion, fear, and possibly even anger, we see here a few examples of faithful service to Jesus. I mean, we're going to have moments like that in our life where we're going to be confused, perplexed. We don't understand what's going on, where it seems like the world's winning and my faith is just constantly being stretched. Those are tough moments for us, because it's in those moments that we have to actually live out all the things that we've said before, especially in church. Things like, yeah, I'll suffer for Jesus. I'll remain faithful to him. I'll tell people about my faith. Those are words at one point of our life and actions in other parts. I love the example of these men and women, because as far as they knew, Jesus was dead forever. It was just over. And yet, Joseph and Nicodemus risked their lives, or at least their reputation in the Sanhedrin, just to give Jesus a proper burial. And then these women are one of my favorite examples of faith, even when things just don't make a lot of sense, because Mark tells us that as they went to the tomb Sunday to finish preparing his body, which meant that they would have unwrapped him, then put the nard on and properly finished preparing his body, as they're going there with all this perfume and the nard and everything, then they ask themselves, hey, I wonder who's going to open up the tomb. It's a pretty big boulder. I guess we'll just do our best. I just find that hilarious that as they're going there, then they ask themselves, how are we going to get to him? That's the type of question that you get yelled at by mom for. Well, what are you going to do, ladies? Didn't think this through all the way, did you? No plan, but they had a desire to honor Jesus in faith that somehow they would be able to do it. And man, I want that type of faith. Not a reckless type of willful ignorance, like always moving forward without thinking things through, but a faith that is so set on honoring Jesus and his body that nothing else really matters. That we actually take steps of faith where we're going into places that we don't really have answers for. We just know this is where we're supposed to go. I don't know who's going to roll away the tomb. I just know that this is how I can serve him now. What if the church acted like that? Or our faith wasn't wrapped up in making sure all the walls were down, where every barrier is taken care of, but we just move forward. What if we were people without excuse? I mean, these women and these guys, they had every excuse not to. I mean, they were risking their lives. They were trying to, they could have been just wasting their time, but instead, they didn't make that excuse. What if we lived as people not making excuse after excuse for why we shouldn't take steps of faith? Because we have pretty good reason to walk in faith and to trust even if things don't look very good. As Marjorie stood there in front of that blackboard with all those things written on it, she just broke down. She was weeping deep sobs. And she finally heard a kind voice call out her name. And suddenly she realized she wasn't there in third grade, that she was back in the present sitting with that counselor who said her name again, Marjorie. And he said, I want you to picture that you're back in that classroom and you're standing there. But this time there's a 26th student. And this student stands up and they walk towards the front, but they ignore the chalk in your teacher's hand, and he just walks over to the board and starts erasing. And everything, he just erases, and it's all gone, and suddenly you're staring at a clean slate. But he doesn't stop there. Instead, he goes back and he grabs that chalk out of your teacher's hand and he starts writing. Marjorie is a beloved, beautiful child of God. Marjorie is forgiven. Marjorie will live with me for eternity. Marjorie, I love. Is that enough? Here's what I've found in my own life is that I picture things like that, of how Jesus came into my life. And all those nasty things that I knew about myself, all those nasty things that I mess up and I'm imperfect, I know He wiped it away. I know that He declares me as something more than all of that He declares me loved, forgiven, taken care of. But is it enough? I mentioned like 3 weeks ago that I, for the longest time, stopped singing the song, Your Grace is Enough, because I wasn't sure if I actually meant it. And I began to think, what if I didn't have my house? What if I didn't have my family? Well, what if I didn't have all the stuff that I have? What if all that I had in this world were the clothes on my back and a hole that I can call a home with no covering? Would His grace still be enough? Because I look at our culture and I see so many things that get stamped with the title Christian that are just so far removed from His grace being enough. We say that, no, God, you must heal. God, you must restore. God, you must bring back and build up and grow that which is mine. Is it not enough that He has built you up, that He has healed your soul, restored your life, brought you back from death, that He has done so much to make you stand strong and grown something out of something that was once dead? Is His grace actually enough? That our God, knowing that probably a lot on our boards was true, but not caring, and coming up and wiping it clean, declaring us His child, is that enough? If you've ever heard of stories of Christians remaining faithful through extraordinary circumstances, it's because they knew their answer. And I know my answer now. But that doesn't matter. When you go through things in this life, can you honestly say, your grace is enough? We're going to sing a few songs as we close here. And if you've never accepted this, then I hope you understand you don't earn it. It's not like you can only come to Jesus when you reach that point that you're finally good enough, or you've battled your sins enough, you've conquered whatever it might be that you think you need to conquer. It's not about that, because Jesus takes us where we are, wherever that is. No matter how dark the hole is, no matter how deep your problems are, He takes you right there, but He doesn't leave you there. And that's the beauty of it. So many people come to Jesus wherever they are, but then they just stop. But He's growing you. He's molding you. He's investing in you. And He's declaring things to you. And He gave it to us. And it's here for you now. If you've never accepted it, you can come and ask me questions about it. You can ask someone you care about and you trust, and ask them about it. But as we sing these 3 songs, we have communion available up here. As we declare and remember His body and His blood that was given in our place, as we remember His forgiveness and that incredible victory and love, we remember His body and blood and what it paid for. And when you take that, I want you to think, is this enough? And when we sing Your Grace is Enough as a last song, sing it if you mean it. Sing it maybe for the first time and declare that. Because what would happen if the church was unshakable? That no matter what we face, we stood on a strong, firm foundation. What if we stopped making excuses for why we can't serve Him and instead just gave what we could to His work? Because if we did that, we wouldn't just be a beautiful church that was unique from other ones, but more importantly, we would look like Jesus to this world that so desperately needs to see Him. If you're able, please stand and let's praise Him now.